Again, everybody. And of course, this is a very important meeting as we begin our preparing for the special session. And I want to, first of all, say I call this meeting to order. And I want to say good morning to our Senate Finance Committee, Appropriations, Public Safety Subcommittee, and our Chair of Finance, Senator Janet Howell. As we prepare for the special session on August 18, I've asked our staff to provide some background information for our members. The public safety section of the budget has 11 agencies, and they perform a variety of functions. You may recall that during the reconvened session, $74.5 million was unallotted or frozen from the new general fund support for public safety to account for anticipated revenue reductions due to COVID-19 pandemic. To that end, our staff has prepared a presentation on the overall budget for public safety, as well as additional information on law enforcement funding and a review of the unallotted actions. Over the past weeks, various committees have also focused on criminal justice reform issues. As we know, the Department of Correctional Justice, Criminal Justice Services oversees state-mandated law enforcement training and certification, and Director Shannon Dion is prepared to present to us this morning on the department's review of Virginia's minimum law enforcement training standards and certification. The staff presentation that I mentioned previously is focused on a budget overview and background information, and not on any legislative proposals. The subcommittee will likely schedule an additional meeting in the coming weeks to go over legislative proposals as more information and fiscal impacts are made available. I've also asked Colonel Settle from the State Police to be on call this morning. At this time, I would like to thank Colonel Settle for being here and to invite you to make an introductory remarks to the subcommittee. Thank you again, Colonel Settle.
Good morning again, and thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the opportunity to say a few words. And I'll keep it brief because I know you and the committee have a lot of work to do. First of all, thank you for allowing us to be on the call and answer any questions that you may have as you work through your presentation. I have a few folks in the room with me, and in the best interest of time, I won't name all those folks off, but hopefully we'll have the right people in the room if there are any specific questions about the presentation. We, as an agency, know, and we're in challenging times right now, and the environment's very challenging, but there's some necessary conversations that need to take place moving forward, and we're willing and embracing whatever the what next is. So thank you, Madam Chair, and again, we're willing to answer any questions you or the committee may have.
Well, Colonel Settle, I want to thank you again for being with us this morning. You're one of my favorite people in the Commonwealth. You do know that, I hope. Now, I will remind our members to mute their lines when we are not speaking, and to turn off our video if you need to step away. I will now hand it over to Caitlin to begin the staff presentations.
Thank you, Senator Lucas and members of the subcommittee. As mentioned by Senator Lucas, this presentation will provide a broad overview of the public safety funding. And moving on to the agenda, the topics will include the funding overview for all of public safety, additional information on state funding for law enforcement, which is a shared function between the state and localities. And that section will have background, including information on funding that goes to localities, more detail on the budgets for the Department of State Police and the Department of Criminal Justice Services, given its role in training and certification. And at the end, there will be a brief overview of the 2020 budget actions, including a reminder of the amounts that were frozen that Senator Lucas referenced. So as an overview, public safety includes 11 agencies with various functions, from corrections to forensic science to police and emergency management and ABC. The area accounts for 9.3% of the state budget, the total state budget, and compared to 10 years ago, that share of the total budget was 10.6%. Therefore, we know that public safety has not grown disproportionately to the overall budget. As mentioned by Senator Lucas, there is also the $74.5 million that was frozen, and there will be more details on that in the end of the presentation. So this slide shows all of the public safety agency budgets for fiscal year 2021. The total general fund available is $2.2 billion. As you can see, that DOC accounts for over half of that funding. These amounts, I'll note, include the frozen amounts or the unallotments that have been referenced. So not all of this funding is available. And the rest of the presentation will focus on law enforcement agencies, including state police and DCJS. Moving on to state funding for law enforcement, which also includes funding provided to localities for police departments and sheriff's deputies under the compensation board. For state police, sheriff's deputies, aid to local police departments, Capitol Police, school resource officers, that amount was $594.7 million general fund for fiscal year 2020. The numbers in this part of the presentation exclude correctional officers or court service officers, so we're just talking about police-type law enforcement. And there are about 19,000 law enforcement officers in the state as of 2019, the vast majority of which are employed by the localities. The state sets standards for certification and training, but actual training and hiring are largely decentralized. And the state police coordinate some data collection, which will be covered in more detail a little bit further on. This slide shows the total funding for those functions that were mentioned on the previous slide: state police, state aid for local police departments, compensation board funding for sheriff's deputies, Capitol Police and school resource officer grants. You can see that the absolute funding has grown over time, but its share of the general fund budget has remained largely constant at around 3% of the total budget. School resource officer grants did grow starting in 2018. The funding available is now $4.7 million per year. There is an additional slide on SRO funding later in the presentation. And I'll note that state funds support SROs in 10% of localities that provided information to DCJS on how they're funding SROs. And finally, state funding is only a portion of law enforcement funding for local agencies, and the following slides have more details on that. For HB 599, which is the funding that is distributed by DCJS for qualifying police departments, there is $191.7 million general fund available in fiscal year 2021, accounting for the unallotments that were previously discussed. In 2019, that funding went to 38 cities, 128 towns, and 9 counties. And although the original program was set up to require the amount to be distributed based on a combination of population, crime rates, and welfare caseloads, the distribution has been constant since 2006. Excuse me. And any increases to the total funding are distributed proportionally based on those 2006 levels. In 2019, HB 599 supported about 9.6% of local public safety funding. And Adam will provide more details on the comp board funding for sheriff's deputies on the following slide.
Thanks, Caitlin. So in addition to the state funding that is provided to local police departments, funding is also provided to sheriffs and law enforcement deputies through the compensation board, which, as you know, is the agency that's responsible for the distribution and allocation of positions to state-supported local constitutional officers and their staffs. So a staffing methodology and workload criteria was developed by the Virginia Sheriff's Association and approved by the compensation board to determine the appropriate level of compensation board funded positions. Specifically for law enforcement deputies, this is 1 deputy per 1,500 population as determined by the most recent Weldon Cooper Center population estimates. Of course, this is also subject to appropriation by the General Assembly, and routinely the state doesn't always fund up to the 1 per 1,500. And for example, in FY20, it was more like 1 to 1,600 population statewide. Looking at the budget for those sheriff's offices.
I have a question, John Edwards here.
Yes,
the
sir.
1 to 1,500, is that just sheriffs, or is that with a lot of localities have police departments and not sheriffs? What's the connection?
It's Madam Chair, Senator Edwards. So that is specifically for the law enforcement deputies, that staffing standard to 1,500, and that's in the code.
So that would be both.
Senator Edwards?
Yeah, Madam Chair, that would be both deputy sheriffs and those localities that have police departments. Is that right?
Senator Edwards, I'll flip back to the previous slide. This slide goes over the funding that's available for police departments. It is, the original distribution was based on code language that establishes it as based on a combination of population crime rates and welfare caseloads, but the funding has been distributed at 2006 proportional levels since then.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, Senator Edwards, too, specifically with the 1 to 1,500 as it relates to comp board position allocation, that is for localities where the sheriff has primary law enforcement authority. So that would not be the local police department. That wouldn't be the localities where they have a police department. Essentially, that would be where the sheriff has the primary law enforcement authority.
Okay, so that's how I read it. Thank you.
You're welcome. And so looking at the budget for those sheriff's offices, it's just under $201 million general fund for the current biennium. That represents about 13.7% of the total biennial budget for the compensation board. State funding for personnel and operations may be supplemented by localities. They're not required to supplement. So essentially, if the locality has the resources and the willingness to supplement not only the salaries of those comp board funded positions, as well as additional positions with their own resources, then they are permitted to do that, but again, not required to do that. And that concludes my very brief contribution to the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions by any member of the committee or Colonel Settle?
We do have additional
April?
slides.
April?
Madam Chair, I believe Caitlin was she's got a few more slides to
Madam Chair?
get for you.
This is Adam Eben.
Senator Adam Evans?
If I could go back to Adam for one question and ask a question. We talked about sheriff compensation for sheriff's department that have primary law enforcement duties. Is there any rationale? Do we compensate police departments that are not sheriff's agencies that do the policing that are not with the title sheriff? Or did I miss that part of it?
Madam Chair, Senator Eben, yeah, I think Caitlin would probably be best to speak to this. We do have funding. We provide funding to local police departments as well. That's okay. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, well, okay. Yeah. I'm just kind of curious the rationale between why we give sheriffs a certain amount of money and how much or what is its distinction.
Madam Chair, Senator Eben, I can speak to that some. So there are different staffing standards for the different types of, the duties performed by different sheriff's deputies. So the sheriff's salaries are based on population, as you're probably aware, and then court services officers have a staffing standard that determines the allocation of those positions for those functions to localities. And then law enforcement deputies, again, is the 1 per 1,500 population. And so essentially it's based on if that sheriff in those communities where the sheriff is performing those primary law enforcement functions, they receive that funding. And then there's a separate a funding source from the state that flows to localities for police departments that perform those primary law enforcement functions that have police departments. I'm not sure if that answered your question or not.
Yeah, so one way or another, if you perform law enforcement duties, you're getting some state funding. It's just...
Yes, that's correct.
Madam Chair and Senator Eben, I'll just add, I think that the funding is split up in the budget by nature of the sheriff's deputies being constitutional officers. That's why that funding flows through the compensation board.
Thank you, Caitlin. That's correct too, right? So those sheriffs are constitutional officers, which is what the compensation board has purview over. So that is reflective of kind of the bifurcation of the police departments, I guess, and then also the flow of funding to the localities with those constitutional officers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Caitlin, shall I turn it back over to you at this point?
Yes. And Thank you, Senator Lucas. And I'll just mention for the members that the previous slide in my presentation, the previous two slides go over the police department funding. So that's available for your reference. And I will move on at this point.
Madam
Thank you,
Chair,
Caitlin.
Madam Chair,
Senator Howell?
I just wanted to try to clarify a little bit. Those of us in Northern Virginia have police departments, so we're getting 599 funding. But we also get some of the comp board funding because I believe all of the Northern Virginia jurisdictions use the sheriffs and the sheriff's deputies to provide protection at our courts and jails and so on. So one of the big battles over the years, frankly, has been rural versus suburban urban, because suburban urban tend to have 599. So we're always struggling to get more funding.
Madam Chair,
Thank you, Senator Howell.
Yep.
sorry to interrupt. I was just going to speak to that, and yes, that's correct. So the 1 to 1,500, what I was speaking to is specifically for those law enforcement deputies. There's a separate staffing standard for court services and other sheriffs in those localities that Senator Howell was speaking to, and they do receive some funding. This is for what you might consider, I guess, a law enforcement sheriff who's performing police-like duties as their primary function, and that's why we focused on this.
Back to you, Caitlin.
Yes, thank you, Senator Lucas. Moving on, this slide is for your reference. It is an overview of law enforcement officers staffing compared to population, and it indicates that Virginia is very close to the national average with 2.3 officers per 1,000 people, and the national average being 2.4 officers per 1,000 people. Moving on to the Department of State Police budget, their funding is $325.6 million general fund for fiscal year 2021. That funding covers about 1,900 sworn officers and a number of civilian employees that support administration and programs, including background checks. As we noted previously, the increases, or as was noted previously on a previous slide, the increases have been consistent with the overall budget growth for the overall state budget, and the main driver of the increases in the state police budget have been compensation actions, which include across-the-board actions that were available for all state employees, as well as targeted actions for state police done in 2015 and 2018. And there is also funding added in the 2020 session for the Community Policing Act, which involves reporting on bias-based policing measures, funding for special operations teams that were added over 2 sessions, and replacement of a helicopter. In addition to general law enforcement, state police has a number of coordinating functions in support of the broader criminal justice system and other law enforcement agencies in the state. The largest program is Highway Patrol, but they also maintain the STARS radio system, which has 21 user agencies and close to 6,000 users, which is critical during disasters and other events that require coordination. Criminal investigations include support to other jurisdictions on multi-jurisdictional crimes, organized crime, and terrorism. CJIS, or the Criminal Justice Information Systems Program, includes the Central Criminal History Record that is accessed by law enforcement, firearms background checks, and other types of background checks for certain types of employment. This section also maintains the data that's reported to the FBI and in the annual crime report. Aviation includes operation of 2 med-flight programs in Central and Southwest Virginia and search and rescue operations. And finally, there are several programs which are mostly supported by non-general funds. So I won't go into those in detail. In a single year budget, the state police spends almost half of its funding on highway patrol. However, as we discussed on the previous slide, some significant funding goes to other functions, such as crime investigations, which includes that support to other jurisdictions, STARS, and the other programs listed here. And I'll highlight CGIS, which is a relatively small percent of the total budget, but it encompasses some areas of recent focus, including gun background checks, which were expanded in the 2020 session to be universally required, as well as expungements and that the crime reporting information. As mentioned previously, the state police have a number of data reporting products, including the annual Crime in Virginia report, which is required by state law. That document includes detailed information on arrest and law enforcement agencies across the state. Much of that data is also reported to the FBI's standardized data reporting project on crime. And the annual crime report also includes a list of officer-involved shootings in the state. And finally, there is funding in the biennial budget for state police to establish a database for agencies to report data on motor vehicle stops and other types of stops in order to study the incidence of bias-based policing. That is the Community Policing Act I referenced on a previous slide. Now I will move on to DCJS. I'll give a brief overview, and then Director Dion will follow me with additional information on training academies and certification. So for the Department of Criminal Justice Services mission includes the function of law enforcement certification and setting the compulsory minimum training standards for law enforcement officers, as well as certification of the various training academies in the state. The aid to localities, which we discussed previously, or the HB 599, that's the funding for police departments, also flows through DCJS. Again, the amount available for fiscal year 2021 is $191.7 million general fund. That accounts for the amount that was frozen during the reconvened session. School safety includes the $4.7 million general fund for school resource officer grants, as well as additional funding and positions for technical assistance, threat assessment team support, training, and the annual school climate survey. For jail mental health, there is $2.5 million general fund per year, which goes to grants to 6 local jails for mental health treatment. And local pretrial and probation is distributed by formula to local community corrections programs. There is $25.4 million general fund available in fiscal year 2021 that accounts for the unallotments or the frozen actions that we referenced previously. There was expansion funding put in the 2020 session budget. However, that money that was for expansion is part of those frozen actions. DCJS's budget is $262 million general fund per year. As we talked a lot about the frozen or unallotments, but I'll just point out that there's $13.9 million per year that is frozen in each of fiscal year 2021 and 2022. And most of DCJS's funding is intended for pass-through to localities. And there will be more information on that on this slide. In fiscal year 2021, the HB 599 aid to local police departments accounted for 76% of DCJS's general fund budget. The next biggest area is the other aid for financial assistance services, which accounts for 20% of DCJS's budget. This is a catch-all program that includes those programs that I referenced before, the jail mental health grants, the SRO funding, and the funding for local pretrial and probation. This program does include some staff and administrative costs, and those costs are about 5% of the program funding shown there. As we previously discussed, there's $4.7 million general fund available for school resource officer grants. The funding was increased in 2018 and 2019 in response to school safety concerns. And DCJS surveys schools for information on the prevalence and funding of school security personnel. And in that survey for the school year 2018 to 2019, a majority of schools reported having some type of school security personnel in the school, and 10% of schools reported using the state funds to pay for those positions or a portion of those positions. Finally, for DCJS, there's budget language in the current budget that requires them to review and update the compulsory minimum training standards for law enforcement, and Shannon is going to go into more detail on this. The language, however, specifies that the standards shall address adequate training in mental health, community policing, and serving individuals who are disabled. And the language also directs that where appropriate, the standards should consider the recommendations of the President's Task Force on 21st century policing. Therefore, the slide has the 6 pillars that were identified by that task force. And their full report has many more specific recommendations that are organized within those pillars. So I won't go into that in more detail. And finally, I'll wrap up with just a brief overview of the 2020 budget actions. Chapter 1289 provided a net increase of $332.2 million general fund to public safety agencies, most of which was in technical budget adjustments to true up the agency budgets from a 5% salary increase that was provided in the previous biennium for state employees. There's also new funding of $27.6 million general fund for hepatitis C treatment for DOC inmates, as well as $9.5 million for general rising inmate healthcare costs. As we discussed, there are a number of actions that were frozen or unallotted during reconvened session, and the following slides have more details on that. For Department of Corrections, there was $42.1 million unallotted for DOC. In state police, I'll just point out that the $6 million for the Community Policing Act, which is for the bias-based policing database, is left available. And then in DCJS, both the increases for HB 599, which is the funding for police departments, and the expansion funding for local pretrial and probation are frozen, but the base amounts for both of those programs are left available. And then you can see on the last line, there was also new funding for data collection on use of force by school resource officers that is available, as that was associated with legislation. For other public safety agencies, I won't go into all these details, but I'll point out that the new funding for part-time positions for the parole board, that new funding for those positions is frozen. And then for your reference, there is an appendix, which is an analysis of APA data on local public safety funding, and overall the state funded an average of 12.5% of local public safety budgets in 2019. And with that, I will end the presentation unless there are any questions.
Madam Chair.
Are there any questions of Caitlin? I recognize Senator Marsden.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, April and Caitlin and Tyler, for your presentation. Just wanted to bring up something interesting. When I arrived as Chief Deputy and then Acting Director of the Department of Juvenile Justice in 2000, our budget was $235 million. Today, as you see, I think it's $231 million. And adjusted for inflation, the department has shrunk dramatically, mostly because in the late 1990s, we had 1,500 kids in 10 different juvenile justice facilities operated by the Department of Juvenile Justice. And today, I checked here last week with the Department of Juvenile Justice, and we're at about 250 state responsible youth in the system, split up between our one remaining juvenile correctional center, Bon Air, and 10 facilities around the state that are called CPP programs, where state responsible kids are held in local juvenile detention centers and receive treatment in their localities. So it's just really remarkable, the reduction in the need for state funding for the treatment of juvenile delinquency, and just kind of an interesting comment on the fact that crime has dropped rather dramatically in the Commonwealth starting around 1995. Just wanted to bring that context to the group.
Thank you, Senator Marsden. Any other questions, Adam?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I think it might be on slide 15 that there was a reference to drug enforcement And I was wondering if I could ask staff or I don't know the appropriate person, when might we know? We decriminalized marijuana on July 1st. When might we see potential cost reductions, or does that take into account any potential, are we forecasting reductions in costs for enforcement on slide 15, or is that something we're going to wait and see as it comes forward in real time?
Who's going to respond to that question?
Senator Lucas, Senator Edmond, I would ask if state police have additional information on what drug enforcement entails, because I'm not sure that that is entirely due to marijuana. So I would ask if state police could give some context.
Madam Chair.
Colonel Sala?
Yes, ma'am. I'll take a stab at that question. I think to the senator's point, it's early in the game, so I'm not sure what those costs might be, but from an enforcement standpoint, we certainly will need to make the adjustments in our agency, and I would think that's the case across law enforcement as a whole. And we just don't have the data now because it is early on since that legislation became enacted. But it'll be something we'll be tracking certainly to see how it affects the agency and what reduction in resources or savings and or costs. So there's a multitude of data that we'll be collecting moving forward.
And if I could follow up, Madam Chair.
Senator Eben? Yes.
Colonel, I would just ask the Colonel, how are the stats collected? Is that something that's done on a monthly basis, or is it quarterly that we can find out if there were marijuana arrests or other drug arrests? How often is that updated?
We can pull arrest data at any time.
We can pull arrest data at any time. So that won't change. So we can pull that real time up to the point where it's, if it's 30 days in arrears, then certainly that'll catch up. But we can pull that data at any time if there's a particular stat or data that is needed.
Thank you.
Madam Chairman.
Yes, Senator Ruff.
Thank you. Colonel, could you give us an update on turnover and personnel shortage at this point?
Madam Chair, Senator Ruff. Yes, sir. Thank you. Currently, our staffing, I'll talk about the sworn positions at this point. We're at 283 vacancies at this point. We have a current basic school in now. I want to say we started with 71 or 72. We're down to 50 at this point. They're about 6 weeks in, give or take a few days. Our civilian vacancies are at 132. We've made some progress with regards to that, but obviously the sworn is where we're struggling a little bit right now. I will say that we have a basic school starting in September. That's going to be a lateral basic school. It's a bifurcated academy. We've done that one time before. It was very successful. That will provide some relief to us. We're shooting for around 70, 75 troopers for that school, and then we're already planning for a January school. We're remaining aggressive and keeping in mind with the COVID-19 restrictions and how we can continue to train personnel safely and in conjunction with the requirements, safety requirements. So we're pushing hard. Our recruitment folks are working hard as well. We're reevaluating our strategies there all the time to see if there's any hidden nugget where we can take advantage of it to increase our recruitment pool.
Madam Chairman, if I could follow up, the turnover in the academy, that approximately 20 that you've lost, what's the major reason for that?
Well, there's probably the major reason, Senator Ruff, is that a lot of these folks don't realize what law enforcement brings to the table, and or the I would say the stressors of law enforcement. And we've revamped our academy from the standpoint of where we slowly expose our trainees to the stress with regards to law enforcement. But some have no life experiences at all. They have recently got out of college, come right into law enforcement, and some have not many work experiences and are still living at home. And so when they come to the State Police Academy, it's certainly a lifestyle that is unique to be a Virginia State Trooper. And they decide that it's not for them. Some find out that they can't make the grade with regards to the classroom part, if you will, and then the physical component of it. Some are washed out because of that. And so we have some that are that leave because of injuries that they sustain. We have some that come in with pre-existing conditions, and they find that this job is too rigorous and too stressful. So we work with those folks. We mentor them. We try to work with them up until it becomes obvious to both us and them that this may be a profession that's not suited for that particular individual.
Thank you.
Thank you for that explanation, Colonel Sutton. I see that Senator Howe's mic is open.
Yeah, thank you. I had sort of a follow-up question for the Colonel. Are you seeing an increase in the number of retirements and or transfers to other law enforcement?
Yes, ma'am. Madam Chair, Senator Howe, yes, ma'am, yes to that question. We, for example, there's 14 retirements just in this month that I was notified of here in the last few days. What I can tell you, I'll give you a stat that may put it into perspective. We had sworn retirements in 2019 of 43. We're at 39 now, and that's a statistic that came to me probably a week ago. So I'm sure that's increased, and we're only got through half of the year. The total sworn loss in 2019, and that is not only from retirements, but to answer the second part of your question, a number of those troopers go to other agencies primarily because of the pay and I will say this, you all have seen the state police more probably in 2020 up front and close and personal since Lobby Day and some of the other events that's going on across Virginia. Our folks have been on the go, so that's not appealing to a lot of folks after it becomes old and they'll go to another agency. But what I will say, in 2019, we lost a total of 126 sworn troopers. That's through separation, transfers, this job's not for me, and or retirement, and we're at 76. And again, that's about a week old statistic. And that's not counting the retirements that I saw on the list today. So we're going to exceed probably double the amount this year if we stay on this same path.
Thank you, Colonel Settler. I see that there are other mics open. No, there doesn't appear to be anyone other than Senator Howe. Senator Howe, did you have a follow-up question?
Madam Chair.
Okay. Senator Marsden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Edwards had a bill in Colonel Settle this year that dealt with an increase, I believe, in automobile registrations that would have funded the pay plan that you had been working on that would deal with a lot of the compression issues and what have you, because mere salary is not the only factor in regards to trooper compensation that is meaningful, and the compression is still a problem. And I believe that when that bill went over to the House, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it called for, they kind of changed it to 2 consecutive or the conference committee did change it to 2 consecutive years of 3% increases plus $125 per year to deal with compression issues. Do I have that essentially correct, or could you straighten me out if I don't have that correct, and tell me what the impact has been of the journey between Senator Edwards' original bill and and what it would have done versus what you ultimately received?
Madam Chair, Senator Marsden, yes, sir. The original bill was attached to the registration, and what that bill would have done is addressed our compression in the agency, and it would have also allowed us to establish a pay chart that would no longer cause us to be compressed. In other words, we have folks that's been on 10 years that's making less than someone that's been on 7 or 8 years, and a lot of that is about a career path, if you will, through the agencies to take advantage of increases in pay. So it would eliminate that, and we came up with a chart, a pay chart, a scale, if you will, that took all of that out of that. So fast forward to the House recommendation. That was, you're correct on that, the 3%, I believe, increase for 2 years on end, and it was $110 per year of service. I believe you mentioned it was 125. So that was very much obviously appreciated, and but it doesn't address our compression, and we would continue to be compressed, and we'd be back every year to address these same issues again. And I've just had a note passed to me that it was 2%, not 3% in that bill, Senator.
Thank you,
Colonel Settle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to comment, I was hoping that Senator Edwards' bill would have really solved the problem and set an example going forward of how state compensation for employees could be improved to deal with compression issues. And unfortunately, that did not happen. And but I still think it's something we need to look at into the future if we're going to retain both in law enforcement and in the general population of state employees, if we're going to retain the services of the best people. This compression issue and compensation still needs to be dealt with. I know we all know that, and this is going to be a very difficult time. But I just wished that things would have turned out a little bit differently this past year. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Marsden. And Senator Edwards, I see your mic is open. Did you have another statement or question?
Yeah, I agree. My understanding is the conference committee is the one that changed it. So I think the Senate budget was in good shape, but the conference committee didn't approve it. Senator Howell would know better than I guess.
Senator Howell is not speaking right now. Senator Howell?
Yes, that is my recollection. And also, I hate to say it, but I've got to leave. I've got my other thing. So I'm about to hit the leave button.
Well, thank you for joining us this morning, Madam Chair. We really appreciate your presence here this morning. And hope you have a pleasant day.
Thank you. I've learned a lot. Thanks.
Okay, next on our agenda is Shannon Dion, and she's the director of the Department of Criminal Justice Services for a presentation. Welcome, and we welcome your presentation.
Good morning, Madam Chair and committee members. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you information on how law enforcement training standards are developed in the Commonwealth. And I will start my presentation now. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see it. Can everybody else see the screen? Yes, we're good. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So in the interest in time, I am going to skip over a few slides that talk about the other responsibilities of our agency. But I will say as wide as the criminal justice system is, that's how wide DCJS is. We support basically every person that is involved with the criminal justice system. I am going to focus, however, today on our Division of Law Enforcement, which is responsible for facilitating any revisions to law enforcement training standards. And I'll explain more about that process. But the division is responsible for generally tracking training for all officers, including other personnel that are not law enforcement, certifying and decertifying law enforcement and jail officers, and some other duties. We have 6 employees who are responsible for ensuring that the criminal justice training academies and the agencies are complying with state training standards by way of audits and inspections. These are the agencies that we regulate for compliance with training standards, and you can see there are quite a number of them throughout the state. These are the type of officers that we regulate, with obviously law enforcement being the biggest category. All right, this is an overview of how training standards are created and updated in the Commonwealth. And state law creates a process by which the Committee on Training is responsible for approving any training standards for law enforcement officers, jailers, dispatchers, courtroom security, corrections officers. And I will talk more about the Committee on Training and on the next slide. But I think the big takeaway here is that the Committee on Training is the final authority on what those training standards are for the entire state, but they don't actually draft the training standards. They rely on what's been created through regulation called the Curriculum Review Committees. And I often refer to them as CRCs, but there are curriculum review committees for each category professional. So there's a law enforcement curriculum review committee and separate CRCs for dispatchers and jailers. And it's a little bit of a misnomer because they don't actually create curriculum, but they are actually drafting the state compulsory minimum standards. And those CRC members work very closely with subject matter experts who are familiar with various topics that make up the training standards. And finally, everything that the Committee on Training, the curriculum review committees, and the subject matter experts do is based on what's called a job task analysis. And I'll talk more about that later in the presentation. But basically, that is an assessment of what core functions and tasks are required for any type of professional, whether it's a jailer, corrections officer, or law enforcement officer. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, DCJS's role in all of this is to facilitate the process by which the Committee on Training and the CRC members and the subject matter experts identify what those training standards need to be. So we managed the job task analysis recently for law enforcement. We provided information to those entities and do some research for them. And we try to capture the intent of what they would like to see in the editing and drafting phases for law enforcement training standards. Here are the members of the Committee on Training, and all of these members are also members of our Criminal Justice Services Board. It's defined by code as to who is going to be on the Committee on Training. And about 2 years ago, we added a citizen representative to make sure that community interests were represented on the committee. But as you can see, there's a variety of different stakeholders because in addition to approving standards for law enforcement officers, they also approve standards for jailers and correctional officers and so forth. All right, as I mentioned, the Curriculum Review Committee is defined by regulation, and the one for law enforcement is comprised of 9 members, and there are 4 regional criminal justice academy representatives, as well as 4 independent criminal justice training academies represented, and also state police. So we talked about the academies, but we've also talked about the Committee on Training. And just to help differentiate between what those entities do, the Committee on Training is as the final approval authority for what those training standards are. They say what needs to be taught, and it's up to the academies in Virginia to actually deliver that training. And so they have to develop their own curriculum and lesson plans and decide how to teach the required state standards. So in Virginia, we have a hybrid structure where we have both regional training academies and independent training academies. And there are 11 regional academies in the Commonwealth that serve a multitude of departments and agencies, and every law enforcement agency needs to be a member of an academy, whether it's a regional academy or if they have their own academy. And these are created by statute, they're independently operated, and they typically have a board of directors. So on the flip side, we have 28 independent law enforcement academies, and they typically serve one agency, and that creates a total of 39 academies in Virginia that DCJS is responsible for ensuring compliance of those state standards with our team of 6 employees. Not represented on these 2 slides are the more than 100 or so satellite facilities that academies utilize to also provide and deliver trainings. So you can see there's roughly about half of all the law enforcement officers go through either an independent or regional academy in the state. This is just a slide depicting some of the state funding that passes through DCJS that goes to regional academies. And just to give you some comparison as to where Virginia stands with other states with similarly sized populations, you can see that Virginia is there in the middle in green. We have 39 academies compared to these other states. All of the states represented in orange allow some of their law enforcement training to be done through their colleges and or community college systems. Compared to the rest of the country, Virginia is probably about in the top 5 or 6 in terms of the number of academies that we have. Okay, now I'm going to switch into the basic training and the required minimum number of hours that the state, through the Committee on Training, requires that each academy provide. So at a minimum, the Committee on Training has said that the academy structure needs to be at least 480 hours. In reality, though, you can see that academies far exceed that minimum, up to 1,500 hours or more. And once a recruit completes basic training and passes an exam, he or she is then required to go through field training, and that's kind of like on-the-job training, and that's so that agencies can actually test their recruits to make sure that they can handle the job, that they can apply what they've learned in the academy setting, and also comply with agencies' policies and procedures. And although the Committee on Training has determined that the minimum number of field training hours is 100, you can see that the actual time agencies put their recruits through ranges very greatly. And once officers are certified by the state, much like lawyers and doctors and teachers, they also have to continue with their training. And the Committee on Training has determined that every 2 years, law enforcement officers must complete a minimum of 40 hours of in-service training. That training is determined and delivered by academies with input from the agencies. And while there are 6 hours that have required subjects, the remainder is left open for general career development. And the reason for that sort of general broad category of hours is that really allows agencies and their officers to select the type of training that officers need to go through in order to fulfill whatever tasks or assignments their agency wants them to do. For example, if you have an officer who's gearing up to become a forensic detective, her academy and her agency are going to make her complete training to further develop those forensic and investigative skills. All right, by way of comparison, here's where we land compared to other states, and we require 40 hours every 2 years, and that is the median. It's for the nation. It's about 20 hours per year. Some states require annual in-service training, some states require biannual, and then some states also require every 3 years. Everything in blue indicates that those are states that have specific mandates on as to what topics need to be taught in service, much like Virginia does. And I'm going to skip over the next couple of slides, but these are here for your reference to show you what other states require in terms of the mandated training for their in-service. Okay, so where are we with updating the current standards for law enforcement officers? There have been a lot of updates made throughout the years, but however, there has not been a complete overhaul of 100% of the training since 1998, and that's what led to the 2017 mandate in the budget language. The mandate does require that the updated standards reflect President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force recommendations. And as I mentioned before, The foundation for any training standard is founded with a job task analysis. And we hired a contractor who was independent from the agency to come in and perform that job task analysis. And he was able to identify which tasks and lessons needed to be taught in the academy portion of training, which tasks are better suited for field training, and which topics are better suited for advanced training. The contractor also recommended that we use a statewide curriculum to ensure uniformity throughout the state of what is being taught. We have worked very closely over the last year or so with the CRCs and subject matter experts to assist them with creating the new standards. And this process has resulted in some draft standards that will enhance many areas of interest. For example, there is a new performance outcome that's been added that addresses bias-based policing and the negative consequences of that. And while the current training standards already include this subject, the new draft standard has a lot more detail, a lot more discussion to include significant discussions of the various types of biases and how to prevent bias-based actions, as well as now requiring recruits to identify and understand the consequences of bias-based policing. There's also a new performance outcome dedicated solely to interacting with persons in crisis, to include communication, de-escalation techniques, and resources that are available to officers. And while this information is already included in current training standards, it's not a standalone standard. All right, this is just a quick overview of our anticipated timeline to finish this process. Before the draft standards go to the Committee on Training, DCJS is going to actually share the content when it's finished with the state at large to make sure that communities throughout the Commonwealth are engaged and are a part of this process. And this is not mandated for the agency to do, and I don't think that we've ever done this in our past, but we feel it's very important that the community really take a look at this and have input into what the training standards are for the future generations of law enforcement officers look like, and have an opportunity to provide input. And we want this process to be open and transparent, and we will take all of that input and take it back to the Curriculum Review Committee and to the Committee on Training for their consideration before they finally approve the training standards. This slide is just to remind me to tell you that we do follow the town hall process, which is available online. Now, once the draft standards are ready to be presented to the Committee on Training, the Committee on Training has 4 options. They could outright reject everything that's been proposed if they determine that the current standards are sufficient. The other option is for them to accept all of the recommendations that have been made as is and approve that as the new training standards for law enforcement going forward. Or they could actually ask for some more work for the CRC to do or make changes right there in one of their meetings. When they meet, these meetings are always open to the public and include opportunity for public comment. Finally, this is just a summary of the process and where we are. We are at the point where the academies and the subject matter experts are reviewing and providing comment, and the CRC has looked at some of the content and has put their input and added their input. And so there's some back and forth going on between those entities. So there are 8 general categories of training that law enforcement officers currently receive. There are no hourly requirements per category or per topic, and each academy develops their own curriculum to satisfy the minimum standards. So there's no one standard that's taught across the state. Furthermore, academies don't have to teach by bucket. So there are subjects within each category that can be interspersed through various classes. And so long as each category is covered in the overall training. So many of these themes and buckets that you see are interwoven throughout the entire academy curriculum. So far, the subject matter experts and curriculum review committee has proposed language in several of the categories. They've reviewed all the categories and they've developed additional content for review. The first thing you'll see is that there's a new proposed category for officer wellness. So that's going to talk about things like officer mental health, physical well-being, and suicide prevention. There are also new standalone topics that have been drafted for existing categories. For example, you'll see in the professionalism bucket, they have added topics such as police ethics, bias-based policing, and the duty to intervene. This slide just sort of breaks down what a training standard is. It's made up of performance outcomes, training objectives, criteria, and lesson plans. All right, I'm going to shift now into some hiring observations that we've seen from DCJS's perspective, but the law requires that hiring agencies do conduct a background investigation. The law specifically says it has to include a criminal history record inquiry, but no requirement beyond that. So sometimes a fingerprint-based criminal history check is all that an agency may do, especially when they hire a former officer. However, many agencies do go above and beyond that state requirement. They will look at things like a psychological test, polygraph test. They'll look at past employment records, past disciplinary records, or ask information for whether an officer, why he or she resigned, whether there's any civilian complaints or use of force complaints. Basically, they will look and ask for their entire personnel file, but there is no state mandate for them to do this, and nor is there a mandate for former employees to actually share that information, even though there is civil liability, civil immunity for that. Now, on the flip side, when an officer is decertified, that is controlled by state law. You can see that this is the list of qualifiers for decertification. And I think I just want to point out to here that there are no statutory grounds to decertify an officer based on ethical concerns that an agency may have, policy violations, or Brady or Giglio violations. Basically, any act that's not shown in this box cannot be grounds for decertification. So, for example, something that's not on here is delivering contraband to a prisoner or obstruction of justice. Those are not convictions that would decertify an officer or a jailer. Since 2015, there have been 44 decertifications in the state. And this slide is just really to show you the process that's created in state law. We have to be notified in writing. If it's not in writing from the actual agency of employment, then we cannot actually decertify the officer. Once we get that information, we immediately decertify the officer in our training records database, and the officer then has the option to appeal or accept the decertification. If he or she appeals it, it will be heard in front of the Criminal Justice Services Board. And regardless of when the decertification is final, DCJS does enter that information into a national database that all agencies throughout the country have access to. And when an officer is decertified, they may petition the Criminal Justice Services Board for reinstatement in 5 years. Some other observations from our vantage point: termination is not the same as decertification. So when an officer is terminated from an agency, that information is entered into our training records database. However, the reason for the separation is not listed there. We have no idea when an officer separates from an agency what the cause was for that. We're just not privy to that information. And finally, by way of our participation in the National Decertification Index, we do upload all of the decertification information to that, and we help agencies get access to the NDI. And so far in Virginia, there are more than 150 agencies at the state and local level that have requested access to that information. And that, Madam Chair, concludes my presentation, unless there are any questions.
Well, thank you, Shannon. I really do appreciate that presentation. And I have one question, and then I'm going to open it up to members of the committee for their questions and or comments. But on a slide, I think that's 16, for the academy structure in Virginia, speaking to the 28 independent academies. You mentioned that they are primarily self-funded. How are they self-funded? Well, I guess maybe it's not so important about how they're self-funded, but what is the advantages to both the academies and or the state? And they're self-funded.
Yes, they are completely self-funded. So in the past, when independent agencies who were previously members of regional academy decided that they wanted to separate and create their own academy, they then took on the responsibility to finance it on their own. And so they do not receive any state funding.
I guess maybe my question is, I wonder, why would they do that? And then, of course, after my question, I see Senator Ruff, your mic is open.
If
Senator Ruff, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to get back to the turnover issue. Shannon, can you tell us or give us any insight into the turnover rate in deputies or law enforcement officers overall?
Madam Chair and Senator Ruff, I can only share with you some anecdotal information that we've heard in terms of turnover. But I know that hiring and recruiting and officers leaving is a significant challenge for law enforcement agencies to handle, and that presents a challenge to them.
As a follow-up, Madam Chairman,
Senator Ruff?
Ask, do you have any numbers on the folks that wash out while at the academies?
Madam Chair, Senator Ruff, I'm not aware of that information offhand, but I'm certainly happy to ask staff and get that information back to you if we have it.
Okay, since you're going to do that, Madam Chairman, if Shannon, if you could tell us or get the information of how many deputies stay on the job less than 90 days.
Madam Chair and Senator Ruff, we can certainly try to get that information. And can I just ask a point of clarification? Do you mean 90 days after they have then gone back and have officially become certified officers within the agencies?
That's correct. Madam Chairman, one of my sheriffs was having such a problem that he started putting people on the road with the deputy for a week before he sent them to the academy, so they understood what the job was before, rather than the expense of the training.
And Madam Chair and Senator Ruff, it's my understanding that sheriff's offices, yes, you do have a year to get your officers certified upon hire. So there is an opportunity.
Okay, Senator Eben, I see that your mic is open.
Yeah, I was just curious if you could, Shannon, refresh me. What does NDI stand for?
Madam Chair, Senator Eben, that is the National Decertification Index.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions of the committee? Subcommittee? Well, as I indicated earlier, the subcommittee is likely to schedule an additional meeting in the coming weeks to go over the legislative proposals or more information as the fiscal impacts are made available to us. And so if there are no further questions, I turn it back over to you, April, for instructions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We will work with Caitlin specifically. We'll work with you, Senator Lucas, as the chair of the subcommittee to schedule an upcoming meeting. And as the staff member that sort of honchos the legislative process, I know Caitlin has been working with the agencies, and we continue to work with the administration to try to get a look at some of those fiscal impacts of the legislation that we know that some of the members have mentioned that they are likely to put in, and there are a few bills that are starting to show up on the legislative information system, and we're monitoring those as well. But as you know, Madam Chair and other members of the subcommittee, they are likely to go through other committees first before coming back to finance to look at those fiscal impacts. But we are monitoring it, and we will follow up with you, Senator Lucas, on scheduling our next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no more questions or discussion.
Madam Chair.
Senator Marsden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If it's appropriate at this time, just like to update you on a couple of things that I think, Madam Chair, you're kind of ground zero on with your membership on rules, finance, and chairman of education. Two things. One, I'm chairing the Commission on Youth this year, and we are studying the teacher-student ratio in our juvenile detention homes. I think there are 24 of them in Virginia. Average daily population about 600 kids, and we have approximately 200 education positions, which means there is one teacher for every 3 children. populations have dropped dramatically. And what we're looking at, and there's a lot of reasons for that high ratio, but at the same time, we're going to take a look at trying to see if there are other ways and means by which children can be continued to be provided with a quality education. But as you can imagine, Madam Chair, that's probably somewhere in the $25,000 a year per chair, not just per student, but very, very expensive. And, the Department of Juvenile Justice has a similar number. I think they have over 100 teachers, I think, at Bon Air. Correct me, that's just my recollection, for roughly 250 to 300 students. So we're going to take a look at that, not this at this juncture this year, but perhaps at a later time. The other announcement is that Senator Ghazala Hashmi and myself and Senator Favola are taking a preliminary look at a notion or an idea that I want to talk with you offline about at a later time, is to work with the community college system to provide ongoing education for police officers that's tied to compensation. In other words, if you reach a certain number of hours in the community college or in certain academy trainings, that would show up in your paycheck, and the cost of the education would be borne by the state, the locality, and the individual officer. It's just very preliminary at this point, but the community colleges seem interested in doing that to create a culture of ongoing training within our police, improve their promotional opportunities and career opportunities, and to provide them with the best education possible in those high liability areas around use of force, de-escalation, search and seizure, these kinds of things to try to do that. It's very preliminary, but you are going to play a big role in guiding us in that regard. We have one other meeting scheduled, and then I'd like to get together with you and certainly with Shannon Dion to advise her and her group as to kind of a direction we're looking at for police officers, and that includes sheriffs, local police departments, and what have you. Obviously, there's going to be some significant cost to it, but it may lead to a resolution for the Senate, at least, to take a look at that after the 2021 session to determine just what that might cost and what the feasibility is. But so far, people seem to think that it is a good topic area for exploration, to deal with the police reform efforts in greater detail going into the future to make sure we have the best police departments and sheriff's departments that we possibly can. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, I thank you, Senator Marston, for those announcements, but I think you give me credit for more than I'm due. But with that, I entertain a motion for adjournment if all hearts and minds are clear.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second that we shall adjourn.
Aye.
You all have a good day. Aye. And of course I say aye. You all have a good day. And Colonel Sanders, settled as always. It's good to see you join us this morning. Thank you all very much.
You as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.